Mr. Lewis, I saw him. Okay, we have Mr. Henderson, Mr. Miata, Mr. Milius, Mr. Balian, and Mr. Lewin. Mr. Lewin, you may now conclude your closing argument.
Thank you. Another theme of the defense case has been the idea that Bob Durst, again, is kind of a victim of bad luck, that in essence, like the title of the miniseries, he's jinxed. It's kind of the idea of poor, unlucky Bob, like the old Allstate commercials where someone was constantly having wrecks and they were just the unlucky driver, like just wasn't their fault. Well, if you look how unlucky he is. His wife mysteriously disappears right before she's supposed to graduate from medical school. He happens to be the last one to see her alive. His best friend Susan is murdered just after the reinvestigation was made public and after she has told him she's going to talk to the police. He finds Susan's dead body, just happens to be in Los Angeles for absurd reasons, and sends a note to the police that only the killer could have written. Morris pulls a gun on him for no apparent reason. That's never been explained. He's accidentally shot and killed during the struggle. Bob responds by dismembering him. He then sits down with Jarecki, who for some unknown reason decides to frame him. And then his remaining best friend, Nick Chavin, falsely claims he confessed. That's a lot of bad luck. But you know what? You can really ask, instead, is it 40 years of undeserved good luck? He has never been held accountable for his domestic abuse of Kathy. He was never held accountable for her death. For the last 20 years, he's gotten away with murdering Susan. For the last 20 years, he's avoided responsibility for Morris Black. Durst is not jinxed. He's a 3-time killer who has managed to escape accountability until this very moment, until you 17 people, 12 of you who are going to deliberate, decide, you know what? It's time for him to be held accountable. All right, let's talk about Nick Chavin. So there's another thing that both sides agree on in this case, in addition to Mr. Durst committing a lot of perjury, and that's the idea that Nick Chavin provided extremely damning evidence in this case. Now we know that in his closing statement, Mr. DeGuerin only chose to discuss the July 23rd, 2015 phone interview where he was being confronted, Nick was, with the fact that we knew that he had told his wife Terry that Bob had confessed back in 2014. Now, as Nick would later testify, and this is important, he was not prepared for that confrontation. He did not know that his wife had reached out to us and had called. This is in the stipulation, by the way. It's in his testimony and in Terry's stipulation. She called us. We didn't badger or threaten her. She called us and told her, listen, Bob confessed to Nick, and Nick has not told you that. So we end up confronting him during that July 23rd call. And we're going to get to that in a minute. But to really understand Nick Chavin, you have to go back to the beginning. And by the way, all these calls were taped. You don't have to guess or understand what did we do, what improper thing did we say, how did it transpire. You have the unadulterated conversations. You can hear what happened. And what this is, and I told Nick Chavin from the very beginning, this is a journey. I didn't expect that Nick Chavin was going to come the first time we talked to him and say, yep, my best friend confessed to murder. And we told him, and you heard it, Nick, our goal is that before you take that witness stand, that you'll tell us what you know. So what happened back on April 6th? Nick's contacted finally after repeated efforts have failed, and he finally returns our calls. From the start of the conversation, Nick is very reluctant to provide any damaging information against him.
Okay, so tell me, so what is your memory about what Susan said about Bob having killed Kathy?
It's hard for me to say. Can't think about it. I want to talk about that.
So he makes it very clear that he is conflicted in his loyalties. He's not saying I don't have any information. He's saying I'm not ready.
Hey, Nick, can you tell me, is it because of your loyalty to Bob?
I mean, it's understandable. You can be honest about it. We're just trying to figure out.
I mean,
Is it because you guys are still friends, or? I love Susan because she gives me a friend. That's her with Bob, so this.
Well,
Your best friend killing your other best friend.
So he's asked during that conversation, hey, if Bob had confessed to you, would you tell us? It's a question I like in case anyone hasn't noticed.
if I were to say to you, hey, did Bob ever admit to you that he killed Susan? And your answer is, I don't want to answer that. Is that correct?
Yes.
That was very important because that's really the first time. By saying that, Nick is in essence conceding, yes, Bob confessed to me, but I don't want to tell you. Because obviously, if Bob hadn't confessed, then he's going to be very, very clear, you know what, he didn't confess to me. However, just because he's saying he didn't confess to me doesn't mean that that's true. So in essence, what you gain from this is even from that first conversation, Nick is having trouble lying. He's very conflicted. So Nick expands on why it's hard for him to talk about these issues and what Susan had always said to him about Kathy. And it's sad, and it's very true.
I know this is tough, but I want you to think about this for a second. Forgetting about Bob for a second, Susan was your close friend, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Forgetting about Bob for a minute, do you want the person who's responsible for her death, do you want that person held accountable? Forgetting about Bob for a second, just whoever that person is, do you want that person held accountable?
Well, you remember what Susan told me about Bob, which was, there's nothing we can do for her now, she's gone, but he's not.
And so the way I'm taking that, Nick, is you're kind of the same thing that Susan said about Kathy, you're now kind of saying to yourself about Susan, right?
Yeah. Well, yeah, he's alive, but he's not.
That's very important because Nick doesn't want to say that Bob killed Susan. But his answer is that, listen, Kathy's dead. I asked him, do you want the person who's responsible to be held accountable? And what he says, well, like Susan said, you know, Kathy's dead, we can't help her, Bob is still here. So the only way you can take that is he's saying, listen, I don't want to hurt Bob, and Susan's gone and Kathy's gone. He continued with his reluctance to reveal what he knew.
That's part of the change that's happened with me. I do want the person accountable, and that's what's happened, has changed. You can do that by just telling us the truth. I know. And I ain't going to be the problem, not in this phone.
Near the end of the call, the following
I know when you get off this call, you're going to probably say to yourself, what have I done?
That's exactly
What have I said? And I can tell you that you've said a lot.
So my intention is to get you as long as I possibly could.
Well,
But I was so far under the radar, it wouldn't happen.
if Bob had confessed to you, if Bob had said, listen, I killed Susan, what would you tell us right now?
Oh, I didn't want it right now. Yeah.
So, wait. So the answer for right now, at least during this phone call, is no, you would not tell us. Is that correct?
Well, I think he's telling us he has all this, and we know the answer. He just doesn't want to use the words. Is that right? I don't see you guys just had it right. I just want a little more time to think about it. Can I just ask you this? Even though it's already out of the bag.
He says the cat's already out of the bag. He knows that he's already taken a step that he can't undo.
It's very clear with what you're saying. It's very clear that you're carrying a big weight right now, and you're trying to figure out what's the right thing to do. Am I being a disloyal friend?
That's exactly right. Go ahead.
Yeah, am I being a disloyal friend? You know, I can't bring Kathy back. I can't bring Susan back. But I will tell you that what's right is right. And I think you know, I don't have to tell you what's right and what's wrong. Bob has said things to you, and I think you know what the right thing to do is right now. And if you can just get yourself over the hurdle, you know, it's almost like ripping a Band-Aid off, Nick. Just...
Everything you say is just reaches right into me, and it's exactly what I feel.
If we call you tomorrow, you'll tell us the whole thing?
No, I'll talk to you and tell you what I've decided to say.
Okay. All right. Hey, listen.
But I wouldn't be saying that. I mean, I just want to say some more.
So what
When you
happened?
get off the phone, the first thing you'll be saying to yourself is, oh my God, what did I say?
What did I do?
Why did I tell him that? And have I told him too much, etc.? You've already told us 90% of it. So
Right.
the Band-Aid's almost all off. So we'll call.
Why I told you I knew that if I told you this much, that I couldn't back away.
Hey, Nick, it is very clear to me there are certain people that don't want to give you information, and there are other people that you just have to figure out a way to let them give you the information they want to give you. You want to tell us this, it's clear.
Right.
So,
Your message was just call me the message that I don't want to talk to you if I didn't want to.
yeah, so you could have done that.
I didn't do that.
No, you didn't.
So that was April 6th. There were more calls that you've heard. But then we get to July 19th, and that's really important because on that day, and this is in the stipulation, we spoke with Nick's wife, Terry. Now, again, Mr. Chesnoff said we badgered her. It's not correct. She called us, and that's in stipulation 73, page 3, lines 14 through 21. Nick, remember, was not aware that his wife had called us. That's why the July 23rd conversation, which is the only call the defense wants to talk about, that's why they played those clips from that date. Now, after speaking with Terry, when Nick was contacted, he was very upset. And at that point, not knowing it's coming, he tried to back away from the information he had provided. Those are the calls, those are the clips that Mr. DeGuerin and Mr. Chesnoff played. Then we fast forward, and we get to October 5th, 2015. And what happens here? I cut that clip. October 5th, there's another call. Let me go back here. Didn't play, did I just double click it?
Let's rip the Band-Aid off. Start with us. Go ahead. Tell us what happened.
Well, I don't want to do that in this country. I got people sitting outside my office now. This is not good. I need to.
Well, okay, so when can we have this conversation?
I'll call you just like I did now. I mean, I've given this a lot of thought, and it's weird. The only thing that's weird to me is how you seem to know what's going on inside my mind. I guess you've done this a lot.
So then we get to October 30th, and that's the call. That's when we finally hear what happened.
We had dinner and we talked, and time passed. And I hadn't brought up, at first I didn't remember, and toward the end of the dinner I remembered we hadn't talked about Susan and about Kathy, what he said he wanted to do, right? You with me?
Yep.
Okay. All right, so after dinner, we're walking out of the place, we're on the sidewalk, and I'm almost panically aware of the fact that one of my objectives was, my objective was really to find out, I needed to hear from him that he killed Kathy and Susan. And then, so then we're outside, and I said, Bobby, he was starting to turn to walk away to go home. We were going different directions. I said, Bobby, he wanted to talk to me about Susan. Here it comes, gentlemen. He looked at me and he said, I had to. I had no choice. I had to. It was her or me. I had to. I had no choice. I had to. It was her or me. He turned and started to walk away, and I said, did you want to talk about Kathy? But he just kept walking. He didn't say anything. I didn't try to follow him. That seemed like a weird thing to do. And that is the confessional that I got from his own lips to me.
And Nick,
Yeah.
how certain are you that when you asked him the question, that it was clear that you were asking him about whether he had murdered Susan?
100%.
So this is an important distinction. Nick Chavin never perjured himself. Never. Nick Chavin was not originally honest on the phone when he was not under oath, But well before he took the stand, he said what happened and he testified under oath truthfully. So when they try to talk about Nick's lying and Nick's perjury, did not happen. All right, so what's the next thing? February 16, 2017, Nick Chavin testified under oath and he discussed exactly what we have just played for you. And this is what he said.
The dinner concluded, and it was then that as we got out to leave, I realized that we hadn't discussed the two things that he had mentioned, Kathleen and Susan. I felt kind of weird that I didn't bring it up. We walked out the door. This is hard. We walked out the door, and on the sidewalk, I said, we wanted to talk about Susan. And Bob said, I had to. It was her or me. I had no choice. And then he turned to walk away and I said, you wanted to talk about Kathy. And he just kept walking away. Nothing more was said.
The passage before it is Mr. Lewin.
So, on cross-examination, Mr. DeGuerin made a strong effort to try and confront Nick Chavin with what he had said the past July. And Nick Chavin was very clear about it.
The passage before it is Mr. Lewin asking you, or stating to you, that what Terry had said, and repeating what Terry had said, and he said, and that finally he turned to you and he said it was either Susan or me, being something that Terry said.
Right.
Did you say, yeah, no, that didn't happen? She told me that she said it, and I said that didn't happen. She said, you told me it did. I said, no, I didn't, and it didn't happen. Now, who's telling the truth there?
Sir, how could she have even known those words if I hadn't told her?
None of us are telling the truth there.
But as far as who's
But
lying,
you tell the prosecutors that didn't happen. That's what you said, isn't it?
yeah, I'm covering up.
So you're lying.
I'm covering up. I don't
Is there a
want to tell
difference?
the truth. Yes, I think there's a big difference.
You repeated that didn't happen.
For 56 minutes, I'm covering up the same thing. We all know it happened. We all know I don't want to admit it. It seems so painfully obvious. I'm lying.
Okay, so you now admit that you were lying.
I admit I was covering up. My answer is that I was covering up. It appears to be a lie. I just didn't want to tell the truth.
And by the way, that's why Nick Chavin, if you noticed, when we would ask him, he wouldn't say Bob didn't say anything until that one call when we surprised him. He would say, I'm not ready, I don't want to tell you, etc. But in the end, as hard as it was, he told the truth, and he did it before he came into court. Now, there's also additional evidence of Bob Durst's motive to murder Susan. And this is certainly, he murdered Susan because he was afraid that Susan Berman was going to be his ticket to the penitentiary with Kathy Durst. That's clear. But she also was certainly, he's a cheap man. I had a bunch of clips showing his cheapness. You're all aware of it. He's admitted to it. His family's admitted to it. There's no way he's giving her 50 grand. And the idea that she needed another 25 to buy an old car, Susan's got him over a barrel. Whether it's explicit, implicit, really doesn't matter. She's hitting Bob up for money and he's got to pay her. I want to talk for a moment because Mr. Chesnoff really focused in on this, and the argument does not reflect the evidence whatsoever. Mr. Chesnoff got up here and told you that for 40 years, Dean Cooperman insisted that Kathy had called. That's not accurate. It's not even close to accurate. What happened is, during the original investigation, Dean Cooperman assumed that it was Kathy that had called him. He assumed it. But no one ever asked him the horrible investigation by Detective Struck. No one ever asked him, well, why'd you think it was Kathy? Did you know her voice? How many times had you ever spoken to her before? How do you know it was her? No one asked those questions. And the evidence, once those questions were asked, showed that, you know what, this is even aside from all the witnesses that she's telling that she did it. This is aside from the idea that, of course, Kathy didn't call the dean. Kathy's dead. Where is Kathy? If Kathy called the dean, what happened to her? They don't ever, of course, want to talk about that. So Kathy called the dean and then just vanished off the face of the earth? So he was never asked, and listen to him, the questions.
Your interactions personally with Kathleen Durst over the course of her entire medical career were approximately 10 minutes.
5 to 10 minutes.
5 to 10 minutes.
Right.
Okay. Had you ever spoken with her on the telephone before?
No.
Had you ever heard her voice on an intercom before?
No.
Had you ever heard her voice on a recording of any kind whatsoever before?
No.
So, are you able to say, based on the voice, that it was or wasn't Kathy Durst?
No.
Why did you think it was Kathy Durst?
She said she was Kathleen Durst.
She said she was Kathleen Durst. So, other than a woman called with a female voice, and this person said they were Kathy Durst, was there anything else about that call itself that told you this is definitely Kathleen Durst?
Now, Dr. Cooperman was asked questions on both direct and cross-examination when he testified. Mr. Chesnoff got up here in closing argument, and he first of all kept referring to how brilliant Dr. Cooperman was, as if his brilliance somehow gives him the ability, when he's never talked to somebody for more than 5 minutes in 4 years, to be able to say, oh yeah, that was them on the phone. But then he said something that's just completely contrary to the evidence, and he had the nerve, the audacity to say, quote, we pressured, the prosecution and law enforcement pressured Dr. Cooperman to change his story. Shame on them. There's no evidence of that. Then he plays a clip where Dr. Cooperman, do they even know what clips they're even playing? He plays a clip where Cooperman says, we didn't put any pressure on him. Listen.
Have you ever been asked by any police officer, any detective, any prosecutor, have you ever talked to him on the phone before?
No.
Have you ever been asked by any police officer, any prosecutor, any detective, prior to meeting Mr. Lewin and I and Detective Chavin, have you ever talked on the phone before?
No.
Prior to meeting us, have you ever been asked, how long have you talked to her in total over the 4-year period?
I don't believe I was asked that.
Who was the first person or group of people to ask you those types of questions?
You and Chavin.
So that's what actually happened. The clip that Mr. Chesnoff played was a different clip. But if you remember yesterday, he argued how we had put pressure on him, and then Dr. Cooper in his answer said, well, they didn't put pressure on me. So that's just made up. It's not true. It's not reflective of the evidence. It's not an argument that's from the evidence. It's an argument that is being made to explain the unexplainable. So what does the call itself tell us? Well, first of all, there are no calls from the Riverside Drive address where Kathy was supposedly supposed to be. I'm not even going to get into the whole idea of why she went back to Riverside Drive when she's really living in East 86th Street, but there's no calls, and there has to be a call. We know that if she called from that area, the phone expert said it would have showed up on the bill. There is nothing. So there's also no calls made from East 86th Street on that date. So what does that mean? Well, Detective Struck, so remember, there are two possibilities. If the call is under 5 minutes, it won't show up. But Cooperman said the call was at least 3 minutes, and we know it had to be transferred from Cook's secretary to Cooperman's secretary. So the call would appear to have been likely longer than 5 minutes. But either way, there's no phone records that show anything, any calls made from either Riverside Drive or East 86th Street, where Kathy's supposed to be at Riverside Drive. So Strzok is asked about this call on cross-examination. And in his interview with Dr. Cooperman, the original interview, Dr. Cooperman discussed and described how there was a signal interruption. For those of you who are old enough to remember this, you used to, when you were on a payphone, when you needed more money, there would be an interruption telling you had to put more money in. That occurred during this call. This call was made from a payphone.
We'll go backward. No, two. Go back two.
No. You went too far. Don't do anything.
Okay.
Okay. But it has to be additional information that the length of the conversation is long enough to have been interrupted by a signal on the phone if it had been from the payphone.
It could have been, but I don't remember that being part of anything that I included in here.
Look at paragraph 2 of the typewritten report.
Okay. Yeah, all right. I didn't remember that until I just reread it.
That's why we've got it here, to help. I mean, this is many years ago when you did this. So now do you recall that you inquired and wanted to know, I suppose, that whether this was from a payphone or not?
Well, apparently came out in the conversation.
So, that is the situation with that call. There is nothing that the defense said in their closing argument that is in any way consistent with the evidence. Kathy Durst told Susan Berman told numerous people she made the call. The evidence is very clear. Every medical student, every co-worker, every person who testified said there would be almost no way she would call the dean, but even if you were going to call the dean, you would absolutely call the person who was on that service. Anybody who knows anything about medical school, about rotations, that's clear. If there was evidence to the contrary, they would have called somebody and they wouldn't have been stipulating. So that's what you know. That's what the situation is. So the whole situation with that call, it's a red herring. We also know, by the way, that it makes no sense if Kathy Durst was making the call, it's coming from a payphone. How is that in any way consistent with anything? And where is she? It's the same thing. All right, that brings up, the defense made a lot of arguments about why didn't we call this witness and why didn't we call that witness. Well, let's be clear. They talked about, if you think about this, Debbie Cheriton had information, Bob's wife, that he said helped him. The judge instructed you, we are not allowed to call her as a witness. We can't. They can call her. Bob Durst repeatedly, if you remember, every time he'd get caught on something, he would say, well, I told my lawyer, I told my wife, etc. Well, where's his wife? How come she wasn't called to testify? Where is she? She wasn't called to testify because it's very clear, and you heard the phone call. If she testifies under oath, Bob Durst has a big problem because it's very clear from that phone call that they both were aware that Bob Durst killed Kathy. That's what that phone call demonstrates. And they didn't call her, and that is something you can consider and utilize. So in other words, that's not evidence that's outside the record. I want to be clear on this. Failure to call a logical witness is something you can consider. If it wasn't, you'd be hearing an objection from the defense right now, and you'd be having the judge tell you it's an improper argument. It's not. So, they didn't call Debbie Cheriton. Who else didn't they call? Barry Weiner or Barry Weiner? Why didn't they call him? He apparently doesn't exist. Obviously, if he did, they would have called him. Why didn't they say, hey, you didn't hear the Galveston evidence? Well, why didn't they put on additional Galveston evidence? And why did they stipulate to all the evidence we put on? Does it make sense to you, ladies and gentlemen? If there was evidence from Galveston that helped Bob Durst with his 7 or 8 lawyers and his millions of dollars, don't you think they would have put on that evidence? Of course they would have. It doesn't exist. That's why it wasn't put on. What else? Well, why didn't we exhume Susan's body? For what purpose? She's shot from behind. There's no struggle. You're not going to get any DNA from underneath your fingernails. And if they wanted to exhume the body, why didn't they do it? Again, the same thing. Why are there no emails from Susan laying out her blackmail, allegedly? Are you kidding? It's preposterous. It makes no sense. They also say, well, why didn't they call Andrew Jarecki? They stipulated to Andrew Jarecki's testimony. If they wanted Andrew Jarecki on the stand, if they thought he was going to help them, you would have seen him here testifying. They agreed. We read his stipulation in lieu of testifying. Then Bob Durst gets up and tells a story so incredible, so absolutely unbelievable, that it'd be like me calling a witness to impeach somebody who says the world is flat. It's not worth the time. We also, well, where's the GSR on the note? Is there any evidence that the defense asked that that be tested? More than that, is there any evidence, you saw the fingerprint powder on the original note, is there any evidence that you would get any GSR anyway? And by the way, because circumstantially we already know that Bob Durst doesn't leave one print in the house because he is touching everything, even though he's touching phones, etc., the inference from that is he was wearing gloves. So the GSR is, again, another red herring. No examination, they say, of the towel or the clothing. What would that prove? And if you wanted that examined, why didn't you do it? So they are trying to, we put on.
Yes.
Mr. Lewin,
What?
Objection, go ahead, state it.
shifting the burden, Your Honor.
Overruled.
Thank you, though. For
Continue.
the record.
The towel was
Yep.
collected by the coroner. The towel was collected by the coroner.
And by the way, the towel was collected. It was in evidence. They could have tested it. And by the way, the defense is up there saying, I'm shifting the burden. Oh no. Oh no. We have met this burden every way possible. What's going on is the defense comes up here and they throw the kitchen sink up there saying, well, why didn't you do this? Why didn't you call this person? How about this? Things that are completely irrelevant. Some things we can't even do, and then they themselves, it's as if Mr. Chesnoff is telling you, well, we couldn't call them. If that was relevant evidence that would have helped their client, you would have heard that evidence put on in this case. You didn't. That's a fact. So when you go back there and you start looking at weighing this evidence, etc., they put on 2 witnesses I'll get to in a moment. That's it. That was the extent of what they've done. Nothing more. Okay, I want to talk about your role as jurors. And this is really important. When you get back there, you are not allowed to speculate. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't talk about reasonable inferences. But if you hear somebody saying, well, what if, I'll just give an example. Well, what if Susan's father, who was a mobster, what if Bugsy Siegel's nephew came and shot Susan at the door? Well, what you would have to say is you'd have to say, wait a minute, whoa. Is there any evidence of that? When they say, isn't it possible, couldn't this have happened? Any scenario that comes up, you have to ask yourself, where is the evidence? Now, it was interesting to note that during their argument, that defense counsel asked you, in essence, he basically told you to go back there, and he said, in terms of even looking at my arguments, I want you, when Mr. Lewin is speaking, I want you to pretend that Mr. DeGuerin and I are answering his questions. Well, here's the problem. They had a chance to answer the questions during their closing, and they didn't do it. They whistled through the graveyard. They ignored everything that Mr. Balian and Mr. Milius put on. So, it is very clear that as jurors, what you can and can't do. Here's another issue. Let's say some juror goes back there and they say, you know what? I hate Bob Durst. He's a horrible human being. And you know what? I don't care what the evidence in this case is. He treated Kathy so poorly, I want him in prison. I don't care whether he's guilty of murder. That would be improper. You'd have to say to that person, you cannot do that. That is improper. And at that point in time, you need to let the court know. You need to tell the judge, hey, listen, that's improper. For the same reason, let's just say there's a juror who says, gosh, you know what? They really proved the defendant guilty beyond any reasonable doubt. But again, I just do not like Mr. Lewin. He is so annoying. I do not like him. And because of that, you know what? We're voting not guilty. Completely improper. If any juror raises that, you need to let the judge know. Because remember, We're not back there. If misconduct occurs, and I mean misconduct, I don't mean simply talking about the evidence, etc. I mean misconduct, then you need to make sure that the judge is made aware of it. So when you go back there, remember, you have to decide this case based on the evidence and the reasonable inferences from the evidence, and we've given it to you. Let's talk very briefly about the special circs in this case. Well, for one, I want to talk about lying in wait. Lying in wait is easy. I mean, basically, whoever murdered Susan clearly lied in wait. There's no defensive wounds. She shot from behind. There's no forced entry. She let him in the house. That's a slam dunk. There's nothing even to discuss on it. I mean, once you decide that Bob Durst committed this crime, there are two things that take no work. One, he clearly did it with a gun, and two, there's lying in wait. The next issue is the special circumstance, and this is what you're going to be told. It does not mean that the defendant, they said they have to prove that Bob killed Kathy Durst. If they don't show you that Bob murdered Kathy Durst, then they can't prove the special circumstance. That is untrue. Absolutely untrue. The defendant must believe the victim will be a witness in a criminal prosecution. What does that mean? That means clearly Bob Durst believes that Susan would be a witness in a prosecution. He's terrified of Janine Pirro. He has told you out of his own mouth that he's known for years that she's walking around telling people that he killed Susan, and that he killed Kathy, and that she is the one who set up the alibi. So that part of it is clear. He certainly believes she's going to be a witness. It does not have to be a pending proceeding. It does not have to be one that's about to be initiated. So the fact that he has admitted that he is worried about being charged, and he's very clear, that's all you need. And then you must end up deciding that the reason he killed her was to prevent her from being a witness. And by the way, again, that doesn't mean, well, it hasn't been filed yet, so she couldn't have testified. If you find that the motive for Bob Durst killing Susan, and let's face it, that's the only motive in this case. The only motive for Bob Durst to kill his best friend, Susan Berman, is because of Kathy. But that motive exists whether Bob Durst killed Kathy or not, because the evidence is very clear, whether it was murder or manslaughter, etc., he helped, he's the one who got rid of her body, and Susan Berman is the one who helped him do it. Now, the special circumstance is not confined to the killing of an eyewitness. So in other words, it doesn't matter that Susan wasn't there when it happened. She is still a witness under the law. Okay, 361. If a defendant failed in his testimony to explain or deny evidence, then you may consider his failure to explain or deny that evidence in evaluating what happened. So examples of this are everywhere. They would include, with respect to Susan Berman, the cadaver note, Susan's planner with no entries relating to the staycation, the admissions during his interviews where either says, Andrew told me to say it, or I was trying to get a plea deal from Lewin. With respect to Kathy, the black eye that was caused by Kathy rubbing a glove over her cheek, the change in his story about whether or not he had an argument with her at South Salem. Remember, he went back and forth, even with Andrew. The first day I had it was a physical shoving argument. The next day we didn't have an argument. He can't remember his own lies. The missing Caldor trip on Monday morning. The man is giving detail by detail of what happens, and he forgets going to Caldor. He didn't forget going to Caldor. He was buying supplies to get rid of his wife's body. The complete absence of any record of a collect call when he was allegedly in Connecticut looking at land parcels. The dig or digino. The Lenox Hill drug rehab. One of the more absurd things in this case. A doctor, a medical student who can go anywhere for drug rehab, which, by the way, she's in the middle of doing rotations, doing very well in them, is going to get rehab in the middle of a rotation, 3 to 4 hours a day, 5 days a week. This isn't a 9 to 5 job. You're a med student on rotations, and then you're going to pick the very place you want to do a residency? Did you see the look on Bob Durst's face when we hit him with the match list? He said, I had no idea. Yeah, it's clear he had no idea. Another lie and another exposure of a lie. That's who he is, and that's what he does. With respect to Morris, the crazy story of Morris firing a gun not once but 2 times in the house. The absence of any hole in the note. The absurdity of allegedly buying Morris a .22 target pistol with a hair trigger when Morris is playing Dirty Harry and Quick Draw with the 9mm and almost shot Bob doing it. By the way, Just so you know, that story about Morris and the guns, etc., it's a lie. It never happened. It was done by Bob Durst to explain how it was that Morris got his gun and how it was that there was a hole, a shot that happened in the apartment. I don't know that we could have ever had a person tell so many lies in such quick succession on a case in history. Yet another instruction, this relates to if the defendant tried to create false evidence or obtain false testimony, that conduct may show that he was aware of his guilt. This relates, among other things, to he and Susie Giordano trying to pressure and influence Nick Chavin. Obviously, it's clear that Bob Durst is aware of what's going on. This is not Susie Giordano acting on her own. The same instruction talks about if someone other than the defendant with his authorization, that's Susie Giordano, attempted to discourage a witness from testifying against him, you may consider this as evidence that the defendant was aware of his guilt. I want to talk about circumstantial evidence for a moment. This case, by the way, if you had no circumstantial evidence at all, with the confessions and with the physical evidence, which is actually, that is circumstantial evidence, the cadaver note, there's only one reasonable interpretation of the cadaver note. And Bob Durst told you. It's a note that only could have been sent by the killer. But the defense wants to talk about what are two reasonable interpretations of circumstantial evidence. The problem is, there's only one reasonable interpretation for the evidence that's been presented. And when you are considering the evidence, you must accept reasonable conclusions and reject any conclusion that's unreasonable. Let's talk about the strength of the people's case. At the end of our case, and it's a tug of war here, the evidence is overwhelming. We've proven in our case, beyond a reasonable doubt, that Bob murdered Susan, that he murdered her because she was a witness to Kathy. We have in addition proven that Bob Durst certainly is responsible for Kathy's death. How exactly it happened, we're never going to know, and that he got rid of the body. And we've proven, by the way, that Bob Durst also murdered Morris Black, and that this was not the self-defense or accident. And by the way, the Galveston jury, their verdict means nothing. They didn't hear the same evidence you heard. You are not in any way obligated whatsoever to say, well, the Galveston jury found him not guilty, so we're going to. First of all, the standard was different. It was beyond a reasonable doubt. Number two, they're not this jury. They didn't hear all the evidence that you heard. They didn't hear everything about Kathy. They didn't hear everything about Susan. And obviously, when you put it all together, you know a whole lot more than they do. But in the end, you base your decision on what was presented in this case, not what 12 jurors in Texas decided to do. So at the end of our case, the conclusion, the evidence was overwhelming. There was no reasonable doubt whatsoever. So what did the defense do? They didn't have to put on a case. They put on a case. And they put on Dr. Loftus. And listen, it is pretty clear. What did Dr. Loftus do? Well, she got up there. Again, it's hard for me to know where to start. She has testified for incredible sums of money. It's her option. Although she said, I believe, $600 is not a lot of money. Mr. Chesnoff said, yeah, she gets paid. Yeah, she gets paid a lot. She called herself a completely unbiased witness, just here to talk about the science. Even though she literally wrote a book titled Witness for the Defense, which she lied about, which she didn't want to agree to. If you notice, the only time I could get an admission out of her was when I impeached her with evidence directly to her face. I don't remember saying that. No, I don't recall that study. I don't think I ever gave that quote. Here's the quote. Oh, I don't remember what I meant by that. I don't recall that. I have no memory of that. For a memory expert, she had a pretty bad memory. She didn't remember anything. Except, you know the one thing she remembered? The one thing she remembered, and I'll admit, it wasn't an accident. Yeah, if I said that she wasn't number, I think she was 58 on the list, and I would just say, you were 59, right? No, I was number 58 on that list. The arrogance and the ego were absolutely stunning. So she gets up there, and Chesnoff says she's not a hired gun, and that I was abusive, and I didn't question her about her areas of expertise. I went through study after study after study. Now, if you remember, Mr. Chesnoff said that I didn't attack the science, I attacked her on everything else. And that, quote, she just testified for unpopular people. He also said that she testified before. He called him Sergeant Case. His name was Sergeant Tim Hennis, was the triple murderer that she testified for. And if you notice, she answered all of his questions without difficulty. But when I asked her questions, she would refuse to confirm anything she'd made unless I could impeach her. And when I asked her specifically about Tim Hennis, what she said was, if you remember, she admitted she'd been on a talk show with him. He was wrongly accused. It was the worst eyewitness identification she'd ever seen. This is the man who would turn out, through DNA, had brutally raped and murdered Katie Eastburn. Brutally raped and murdered her, as well as murdering 2 of their 3 little daughters, Erin and Kira, both under 5. And Loftus testified, you know what, DNA is the gold standard, except on that case, if you remember. Well, I don't really know about DNA, and I'm told that there might have been contamination. Yeah, think about that. Tim Hennis' semen happened to materialize in the box over time. It just appeared there. It's absurd. Why is she doing that? Because she doesn't want to admit that she was wrong, that the worst eyewitness identification that she's ever seen, one of them, turned out to be dead on right. And by the way, even after that's done, she's giving interviews within the last 4 or 5 years mentioning how he was acquitted and not even telling the reporter in Orange County, oh, by the way, it turns out that DNA showed that he was a murderer. She was not neutral. She was not unbiased. Then we get to Bob Durst. What did his testimony prove? He has no respect for the truth. He perjured himself in every way and about nearly every material issue in this case. That's what we learned about their testimony. So, at the conclusion of the people's case, the evidence was overwhelming. After the defense case, our evidence was even stronger. We talked about circumstantial evidence. Remember this photo from the beginning of the case? What happened? Yeah, it was Boomer. All right, the evidence of Durst's motive to, I want to talk briefly about the NYPD investigation. Detective Struck. The defense called him as their witness. Remember, they called him, and the original testimony was to talk about what a great job he had done on the case.
I want to give you an opportunity to answer that here in open court and on the record. Did you do your dead level best in your investigation?
Yes.
Now remember, they have the discovery. They know what he's done and not done. They know he had sex with a witness. They know he didn't ever search the house. They know he never went to the trains. Yet they're putting him on to basically say what a great job he
Object to
did.
that argument, Your Honor, that
What's the objection?
He objects to the argument.
to the record.
To the record, no.
It mistakes the record.
Overruled.
Did you do your best to solve this mystery back in 81, 82, 83?
Absolutely. From my professional and personal, I thought we did whatever we could with what we were presented with what direction we had. I had held this case important where I took a lot of it home with me that I had copies of, because I knew that if it wasn't solved over the years, hopefully it would remain a cold case and then somebody would resurrect it along the way. But I'm professionally uncomfortable with what we had done at the time before the case got really cold, yeah.
This was his direct. He was even cocky. Listen to this answer. The
Do you feel
nerve.
like NYPD failed to investigate Kathy's disappearance?
If this wasn't such a serious topic, I would laugh.
He was asked to grade himself.
But I think collectively with my colleagues and my bosses, our game plan and how we handle this, I'm comfortable.
Well, let her break. You're in school when you get yourself.
Yeah, I give myself a B.
A B? He's literally having sex with a witness. He's staying over at another witness's house. He's having Mary Hughes buy him beer. He's taking concert tickets when he meets the family. My God, if that's a B, what's an F? What grade would the defendant give Detective Struck? Well, listen, Bob Durst needs Detective Struck to have done a good job. He said, I believe the police have gone above and beyond the call of duty. What information did Detective Struck have at the time?
Mr. Durst told you during your interview with him that no owner of apparent marital problems. When you did your investigation, did you discover that to be true?
Oh, no.
In fact, there was a lot of marital problems, correct?
Correct.
He knew about the domestic violence in the relationship, but he did nothing.
So is it fair to say that very early in this investigation, February 5th, February 8th, February 9th, you're getting repeated statements from different witnesses saying that Bob is physically abusing Kathy, correct?
Correct.
He knew from very early on that Bob Durst was lying about his alibi. He did not have drinks with the mayor. What did he do about it? Nothing.
So Bob Durst is telling you, he's giving you his alibi for the exact night that you believe at this point Kathy Durst has disappeared, correct? Is that right? And he's telling you that night that after he drops her off on the train, he was very clear he was the last person to see her alive. Is that correct?
Yes.
By the way, is there anybody else in the world that you know of that could support seeing Kathy Durst get on that train other than Bob Durst?
No.
So he tells you, got back, I had drinks with the mayors, and you go and you talk to the mayors, and the mayors tell you that never happened.
Correct.
He does nothing. He doesn't go check the trains. He doesn't interview anybody. He does zero. But he did say that early on he believed Bob Durst was responsible.
And you believe, at the end of your investigation, that was your belief that Bob Durst was responsible for Kathy's disappearance and death. Is that correct? And let me ask you, can you tell me when it was during the investigation that you came to that opinion?
Really early on.
So, what follow-up did Detective Struck do? They never searched the house. Although Mr. Chesnoff said not one scintilla of evidence was found in the house. Yeah, when they searched it 20 years later. I mean, does that make sense? Did Mr. Chesnoff tell you, listen, it wasn't searched in '82, so I'm telling you about something that happened 20 years later? Of course not. What follow-up did he do about the domestic violence? How many of the doctors that we interviewed, did he talk to Dr. Halperin or Dr. Wilk?
Would you agree, Detective, that you did not specifically, so are you aware that earlier in January '82, the same month Kathy disappeared, she disappeared January 31st, are you aware that she sought treatment at Jacoby Hospital for injuries to her face? You aware of that?
I believe I am.
In fact, you were aware of that back in 1982 because those are records that you got, correct?
I believe so, yeah.
Detective, you would agree that in getting those records, the first thing that you're going to do when you get a record like that is you're going to call the treating physician who treated her, correct?
Well, it would have been good if we had done that. Why it was not done, I don't know.
He made no effort, which he admits, to search the very place that Kathy had last been seen.
So, would you agree, Detective, that that house, during the original investigation, was never thoroughly searched and processed by you or your representatives from NYPD?
Correct.
And would you also agree that as far as you know, that house was never thoroughly processed or examined by any other law enforcement agency other than what
Trooper Harding told you he noticed walking in looking for a body lying around.
That's correct.
Would you agree, Detective, that that was absolutely a huge mistake on your part, not having that done?
Looking back on it now, it would have probably been a good thing to do.
He didn't want to admit any responsibility. When I hit him with, how come you didn't review, you were told she was flunking out of medical school and it wasn't true. Why didn't you go through the records? You know what he said? It would have been a good thing to do. He was asked about the fact that you're aware that Bob Durst didn't report her until days after she went missing. Did you do any follow-up? Yeah, you know what? Sitting here today, I probably should have gone to the rotation. That would have been helpful. I would have found out she wasn't staying overnight. I should have done that. It probably would have helped. Even though he was aware of the call to Dr. Cooperman, he made no effort to investigate any of the issues about why did Dr. Cooperman think it was Kathy. Never asked him, never did anything. Now that one he says, yeah, that was a mistake. Although he learned of the gathering at Gilberta's on that Sunday afternoon, he didn't do any follow-up. He's asked, did you speak to her sisters? Oh, I didn't know she had any. That's his testimony. So what was Detective Struck spending his time doing during the investigation? He was going to free Neil Diamond concerts. He was accepting beer from witnesses. He was drinking and spending the night at a witness's house. And he was having sex with a witness. I mean, you can't make this up. It was beyond incompetent. It was beyond negligent. It was disgusting. It was horrific. And it's one of the reasons that Bob Durst has been walking around for all these years. The Morris Black murder.
You want Morris Black?
Yeah. So it was very clear that when the doctor got up there and testified, that he absolutely dismissed everything that Mr. DeGuerin asked him about giant crabs and sinking heads, etc. He said no chance, would never have happened. Cannot see it. Mr. DeGuerin continued to try to push him, and the doctor just slammed the door shut. And this is an unbiased expert. And if there was an expert that would have testified to that head having sunk, that head having been carried away, the defense would have called him. Let's go to the end. You know what?
Can we go
Stop
back?
it. Let's go back. Let's put, I think we have time for those clips.
No, that's it.
Okay. So, we're just about done. I've got now 5 minutes. So, as I've said, the evidence in this case is absolutely overwhelming. This is not a difficult job. You're going to go back there in a few minutes. And based on the evidence that you have, this is not a tough decision. This does not need to be a lengthy decision. If there's anybody, any of you, who are going, you know what, I don't think they've proven that Bob Durst murdered Susan Berman, you have to ask yourselves, what more could we give you? What more could Mr. Durst give you? It's out of his mouth. It's out of the cadaver note that only the killer could have written. It's the staycation. It's the confessions to Nick Chavin. It's the confessions on the stand. There's direct, circumstantial. The evidence in this case against Bob Durst, not just for Susan, but for Kathy and Morris. This is what we have. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a mountain of evidence. amounted. This case started back in January 31st, 1982, when this man killed his wife. This man. I don't care that he's old. I don't care that he's sitting in a wheelchair. I don't care that he's sick. It's irrelevant. He has killed 3 people in this case. 3 people. It is time that he is held accountable. And the evidence in this case is proven. I want to be clear. I'm not saying convict Bob Durst because he killed Kathy, or convict Bob Durst because he killed Morris. I'm telling you, this man murdered Susan Berman. He murdered her. Absolutely, unequivocally, positively. That's what he did. We've done our job on this case. We can't do anymore. You guys now have this case. It's going to be yours. It is never easy to have to convict somebody of murder. And some of you might want to say, well, he's old and he's decrepit, and why does it really matter? It matters because of Kathy and of Morris and of Susan. Justice matters. Consequences matter. Do not let this narcissistic psychopath get away with what he has done, what he did to Susan Berman. There's one verdict in this case, one verdict only. That is guilty. That is guilty of special circumstances, having killed Susan Berman with a firearm, having done so by lying in wait, ambushing his trusted friend, putting a bullet in the back of her head, which thank God she never saw coming, doing it because she was a witness, because he didn't want to accept the consequences of his conduct. Make him accept the consequences. Go back there, ladies and gentlemen, and please do your job, do your duty. This is not a difficult case. This is not hard. It's overwhelming. Please go back there and make this man accept the consequences for murdering his best friend, Susan Berman. Again, I want to thank you all for your time and for your attention. I'm sorry this has gone on for so long. And again, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Lewin. Ladies and gentlemen, when you go to the jury room, the first thing you should do is choose a foreperson. The foreperson should see to it that your discussions are carried on in an organized way and that everyone has a fair chance to be heard. It is your duty to talk with one another and to deliberate in the jury room. You should try to agree on a verdict if you can. Each of you must decide the case for yourself, but only after you have discussed the evidence with the other jurors. Do not hesitate to change your mind if you become convinced that you are wrong, but do not change your mind just because other jurors disagree with you. Keep an open mind and openly exchange your thoughts and ideas about this case. Stating your opinions too strongly at the beginning or immediately announcing how you plan to vote may interfere with an open discussion. Please treat one another courteously. Your role is to be an impartial judge of the facts, not to act as an advocate for one side or the other. As I told you at the beginning of the trial, do not talk about the case or about any of the people or any subject involved in it with anyone, including but not limited to your spouse or other family or friends, spiritual leaders or advisors or therapists. You must discuss the case only in the jury room and only when all jurors are present. Do not discuss your deliberations with anyone. Do not communicate using Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, or any social media during your deliberations. It's very important that you not use the internet in any way in connection with this case during your deliberations.
During the trial, several items were received into evidence as exhibits. You may examine whatever exhibits you think will help you in your deliberations. These exhibits will be sent into the jury room with you when you begin to deliberate. If you need to communicate with me while you are deliberating, send a note through the bailiff, signed by the foreperson or by one or more members of the jury. To have a complete record of this trial, it is important that you not communicate with me except by written note. If you have questions, I will talk with the attorneys before I answer, so it may take some time. You should continue your deliberations while you wait for my answer. I will answer any questions in writing or orally here in open court. Do not reveal to me or anyone else how the vote stands on the issues in this case unless I ask you to do so. Your verdict on each count and any special findings must be unanimous. This means that to return a verdict, all of you must agree to it. Do not reach a decision by the flip of a coin or any similar act. It is not my role to tell you what your verdict should be. Do not take anything I said or did during the trial as an indication of what I think about the facts, the witnesses, or what your verdict should be. You must reach your verdict without any consideration of punishment. You will be given verdict forms. As soon as all the jurors have agreed on a verdict, the foreperson must date and sign the appropriate verdict form and notify the bailiff. Returned any unsigned verdict form. To the alternate jurors, the jury will soon begin deliberating, but you are still alternate jurors and you are bound by my earlier instructions about your conduct. Do not talk about the case or any of the people or any subject involved in it with anyone, not even your family or friends, and not even with each other. Do not have any contact with the deliberating jurors. Do not decide how you would vote if you were deliberating. Do not form or express an opinion about the issues in this case unless you are substituted for one of the deliberating jurors. Please swear the bailiff.
Do you solemnly swear that you will take charge of the jury and keep them together, that you will not communicate with them yourself, nor allow anyone else to communicate with them upon matters connected with the case except on order of the court? And when they have agreed upon a verdict, you will return them into the court. And furthermore, do you solemnly swear that you will take charge of the alternate jurors and keep them apart from the jury while they are deliberating on the cause until otherwise instructed by the court, so help you God?
I do.
Thank you. Please state your name for the record.
Deputy Marshal.
Thank you, sir.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you're now committed to the custody of our bailiff to retire and deliberate upon your verdict.